We've all seen accidents happen. But have you ever stopped to wonder how the law decides if a mistake was, well, just a mistake, or if someone was actually at fault? Today, we're going to dig into the legal measuring stick for our actions, the standard of care. So, to get us started, let's chew on a real legal puzzle. Imagine a learner driver, someone who, by definition, is still figuring things out, crashes the car and injures their instructor. Does the law cut them some slack because they're new to this? Or does it hold them to the exact same standard as every other driver on the road? Hang on to that question because we are definitely coming back to it. You see, before any court can point a finger and assign blame, it needs a consistent way to judge what happened. Without some kind of benchmark, every decision would just be a total guess. And that benchmark is what the law calls the standard of care. So what exactly is this standard of care? Well, think of it as the level of caution the law expects from a so-called reasonable person in any given situation. The key here isn't what you thought was fine, but what an average, sensible person would have done if they were in your shoes.
And this is absolutely crucial. The standard is objective. The law isn't really interested in whether you tried your hardest or did your personal best. It compares what you did to an external universal yardstick. If your actions fall short of that line, you've probably breached your duty of care. This whole concept hinges on this kind of strange, hypothetical figure, the reasonable person. But who in the world is this person the law keeps talking about? Let's meet them.
The courts have this wonderfully old-fashioned way of describing this person, the man on the back of the Clapton omnibus. The idea is pretty simple. We're talking about your average Joe, just an ordinary person riding the bus.
Now, this legal fiction isn't some kind of superhero, but they're not a complete novice either. Just think of someone with a normal temperament, someone who has the basic common knowledge we all pick up through life. They're not an expert in anything special, which, makes them the perfect neutral yardstick for judging everyone else's behavior.
But what happens when the person we're talking about isn't average? What if they have special skills or training, like a doctor or an engineer? Well, this is where the law says, hold on a minute, we need to raise the bar. Let's picture a medical emergency. For most of us, the reasonable thing to do is to call for an ambulance. But if a doctor happens to be on the scene, the law expects a lot more. They're held to a higher standard because of that expertise. They can't just act like any other bystander. This whole principle is known as the Bolam test, and it comes from a famous old case. It basically says that professionals aren't judged against the average person on the bus, but against the standards of their own profession. The question becomes, would other doctors, or other lawyers, or other architects say they acted correctly?
Okay, so the bar gets raised for professionals. That makes sense. But what about the other end of the spectrum? What about learners or people who are brand new at something? Does the law lower the bar for them?
And here it is, the answer to our opening question. In a huge case called Nettleship v. Weston, the court made its decision crystal clear. That learner driver was not judged by the standard of other learners. No, she was judged by the standard of a reasonably competent, fully experienced driver. So the big takeaway here is really simple, but also pretty harsh. The law does not make allowances for inexperience. It doesn't matter if you've been driving for 20 years or just 20 minutes, you're held to the exact same standard of care. Now, there is one major exception to this really rigid rule, and it's all about children. The law does recognize that, well, it would be completely unfair to judge a kid's actions by the same standard we use for an adult. This idea was really cemented in a case called Mullen v. Richards, which actually involved two schoolgirls having a mock sword fight with plastic rulers. The court decided that a special, modified standard was needed for kids, one that judges them against a reasonable child of the same age. So, how does this work in practice? First, the court looks at the child's age. Then it compares what they did to what a reasonably sensible child of that very same age would have done. And, of course, as a child gets older and closer to adulthood, this standard gets progressively closer to the adult one. All right, let's just pull this all together for a second. The Bolam case raises the standard for professionals. The Nettleship case keeps that standard exactly the same for the inexperienced, and the Mullen case modifies the standard for children. 3 key scenarios, 3 very different outcomes.
At this point, you might be thinking, wow, holding a learner driver to the same standard as an expert, that seems really tough. And it is. But there's a huge reason why the courts are so hesitant to move away from this objective standard. Think about it. If the standard was subjective, if it changed for every single person based on their own skill level, the legal system would be pure chaos.
How could you ever know what standard you are supposed to meet? It would open the floodgates to lawsuits for every little thing, creating a world of uncertainty for all of us.
What it all boils down to is this: the objective standard of care exists to protect the public. When you get into your car or walk into a hospital, you have a right to expect a certain level of safety and competence from everyone around you. This standard is what protects that right for all of us.
And that brings us to one last, really big question. The law chooses predictability and public safety over an individual's personal circumstances for the greater good. But is a system that values objectivity above all else always fair to the individual? Is an objective standard always a just standard? That's definitely something worth thinking about.